The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground at Fort Braxton as 500 soldiers gathered in formation. The air buzzed with anticipation and the usual pre-demonstration chatter that filled military bases worldwide. Today was special. It was the annual hand-to-hand combat demonstration where the best fighters from different units would showcase their skills. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stood quietly at the edge of the demonstration area, adjusting her regulation combat uniform. At 28, she had earned her place among the elite through years of dedicated training and countless hours perfecting her martial arts techniques. Her small frame often fooled people. She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighed no more than 130 pounds. But those who knew her understood that underestimating Maria was a dangerous mistake. The daughter of immigrants from El Salvador, Maria had joined the army 8 years ago with something to prove. Her father had worked double shifts in a factory to support their family, while her mother cleaned office buildings at night. They had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they never had. For Maria, military service was not just a career. It was a way to honor their struggles and show that their sacrifices meant something. Her journey to this moment had been anything but easy. Basic training had tested every limit she thought she had. The physical demands were brutal, but the mental challenges proved even harder. Some instructors doubted whether someone her size could handle combat situations. Some fellow recruits made crude jokes about women in combat roles. But Maria never backed down. She trained harder than anyone else, studied military tactics late into the night, and gradually earned the respect of those around her. After basic training, Maria discovered her natural talent for martial arts. She had always been athletic. She played soccer in high school and ran track, but military hand-to-hand combat training revealed abilities she never knew she possessed. Her small size became an advantage rather than a limitation. She was fast, flexible, and had an instinctive understanding of leverage and momentum that larger opponents struggled to counter. Her first instructor, Sergeant First Class Williams, recognized her potential immediately. "Rodriguez," he told her after a particularly intense training session, "you've got something special. Most people try to overpower their opponents. You understand how to use their strength against them." Williams introduced her to advanced martial arts training beyond the standard military curriculum. Maria studied Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and traditional karate. She learned that true strength came not from muscle mass, but from technique, timing, and mental preparation. Every movement had purpose. Every technique had been refined through centuries of development. Most importantly, she learned that martial arts was as much about discipline and respect as it was about fighting. Over the years, Maria competed in military martial arts tournaments across the country. She won more often than she lost, earning recognition and several commendations. Her commanding officers began asking her to demonstrate techniques to new recruits. She developed a reputation as someone who could teach both the physical and mental aspects of combat training. But today felt different. The demonstration was larger than usual, with soldiers from multiple bases attending. Military brass from division headquarters had come to observe. There were rumors that some of the techniques demonstrated today might be incorporated into updated training protocols. The pressure was significant. As Maria surveyed the crowd, she noticed familiar faces mixed with strangers. Her unit was well represented, and she felt confident knowing her fellow soldiers supported her. But she also spotted members of units she was less familiar with, including some soldiers whose reputations preceded them for all the wrong reasons. Near the far end of the gathering, Staff Sergeant Derek Mason stood with his arms crossed, talking loudly to the soldiers around him. Maria had heard about Mason before today. He was known throughout the base for his aggressive attitude and his old-fashioned views about women in combat roles. At 32, Mason was a career soldier who had served 3 deployments overseas. He was built like a linebacker, standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing close to 240 pounds. His hands looked like they could crush cinder blocks, and his voice carried across any room he entered. Mason had a reputation for pushing boundaries during training exercises. Several female soldiers had filed informal complaints about his behavior, though nothing serious enough to result in formal disciplinary action. He made comments about women being too weak for real combat. He questioned whether female soldiers could handle the physical demands of military service. Most people ignored him, knowing that engaging with his provocations only made things worse. But Mason had a problem that went beyond his attitude toward women. He had a problem with being shown up by anyone he considered beneath him. And in his mind, that included anyone smaller, younger, or different from him. He especially had a problem with skilled fighters who made him look inadequate. 6 months earlier, during a routine training exercise, Mason had sparred with Corporal Jennifer Hayes, a female soldier known for her boxing skills. Hayes had landed several clean hits during their match, demonstrating superior footwork and hand speed. Instead of accepting the outcome professionally, Mason complained loudly that the rules were unfair and that real combat was different from sport fighting. The incident had created tension within his unit. His commanding officer had spoken with him privately about maintaining professional standards during training. But Mason seemed to take the conversation as confirmation that everyone was against him rather than as constructive feedback about his behavior. Now, watching Maria prepare for the demonstration, Mason felt that familiar anger building inside him. He had heard about her tournament victories and her growing reputation as an instructor. The thought of another small woman showing off her skills in front of hundreds of soldiers bothered him more than he cared to admit. "Look at that," Mason muttered to Private Johnson, who stood next to him. "They're really going to let her show us how to fight? What's next? Combat tips from a kindergarten teacher?" Johnson, barely 19 and still new to the military, laughed nervously. He had learned quickly that agreeing with Mason was easier than challenging him. But privately, Johnson wondered why Mason seemed so threatened by skilled fighters regardless of their size or gender. "I heard she's actually pretty good," Johnson said carefully, trying to balance honesty with diplomacy. Mason's jaw tightened. "Pretty good at what? Dancing around? Real fighting isn't about fancy moves and tournament points. It's about who can take a hit and keep going. It's about raw strength and aggression. These martial arts demonstrations are just choreographed dancing." Other soldiers nearby began to notice Mason's comments. Some nodded in agreement, either because they shared his views or because they wanted to avoid conflict. But others exchanged glances that suggested they disagreed with his assessment. The division between old-school military thinking and more modern approaches to combat training was evident in the crowd's reaction. Sergeant Rodriguez had no idea that she was already the subject of controversy. She was focused on mentally preparing for the demonstration, running through the techniques she planned to show. Her instructor had emphasized the importance of clear explanation along with physical demonstration. The goal was not just to impress the audience, but to teach them principles they could apply in real situations. The demonstration was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Maria checked her equipment one final time and took several deep breaths to center herself. She had performed in front of large crowds before, but something about today felt more significant. Perhaps it was the size of the audience, or perhaps it was the knowledge that her performance might influence future training programs. As she moved toward the demonstration area, Maria caught sight of Mason's group. She had heard enough about him to recognize him immediately, and his body language suggested he was not a friendly observer. But Maria had dealt with skeptics and critics throughout her military career. Her approach had always been the same: let her actions speak louder than words. The lead instructor for the demonstration, Master Sergeant Patricia Collins, called for the audience to gather closer to the demonstration area. Collins was a 20-year veteran who had earned respect throughout the military for her combat experience and her innovative approach to training. She believed strongly that effective combat training required input from the best fighters, regardless of their background or physical characteristics. Today's demonstration will focus on practical self-defense techniques that can be applied in various situations, Collins announced to the crowd. Our instructors will show you how proper technique can overcome advantages in size and strength. These are not theoretical concepts. They are proven methods that can save your life in real situations. Maria took her position in the demonstration area as Collins continued the introduction. The crowd fell silent, with 500 pairs of eyes focused on the small woman in the center of the dusty training ground. For a moment, she felt the weight of their expectations and their skepticism. But as she had learned through years of training and competition, the key to success was focusing on the task at hand, rather than worrying about other people's opinions. She blocked out the crowd, blocked out the pressure, and prepared to show exactly what she was capable of. What neither Maria nor anyone else in the crowd realized was that this demonstration was about to become much more than a planned training exercise. The tension that had been building for months was about to explode in a way that would change several lives forever. Mason watched from the crowd, his resentment growing with each passing second. In his mind, this entire demonstration was an insult to real soldiers who had earned their place through blood, sweat, and combat experience. He was tired of political correctness and tired of pretending that everyone was equal when clearly they were not. As the formal demonstration began, Mason made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He decided that if the military wanted to promote fairy tale ideas about combat effectiveness, he was going to provide a reality check that everyone would remember. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Maria had learned about martial arts, military discipline, and her own inner strength. In just a few minutes, her years of training would be put to the ultimate test in front of hundreds of witnesses. Neither Maria nor the crowd was prepared for what was about to unfold on that dusty training ground under the morning sun. The demonstration began exactly as planned. Master Sergeant Collins introduced each technique methodically, explaining the principles behind effective self-defense before Maria demonstrated the physical application. The morning air was crisp, and the assembled soldiers stood in neat formations around the demonstration area, their attention focused on every movement. Maria started with basic techniques: how to break free from a wrist grab, how to escape from a bear hug, how to create distance from an attacker. Her movements were fluid and precise, each technique executed with the kind of perfection that comes from thousands of hours of practice. She explained each step clearly, emphasizing that these techniques worked because they used an attacker's momentum and aggression against them. The key principle here, Maria said as she demonstrated a simple wrist escape, is that you never fight force with force when you're at a disadvantage. Instead, you redirect that force and create an opportunity to counter or escape. The crowd watched intently as she worked with Corporal Martinez, her training partner for the demonstration. Martinez was a good sport, allowing himself to be thrown and locked up repeatedly as Maria demonstrated various techniques. The soldiers in the audience began to murmur appreciatively as they saw how someone Maria's size could control someone much larger through proper technique. But not everyone in the crowd was impressed. Mason stood with his arms crossed, his face twisted in a scowl that had deepened with each technique Maria demonstrated. To him, this entire show was a dangerous fantasy that gave people false confidence in situations where their lives might depend on real combat effectiveness. "This is ridiculous," Mason whispered harshly to the soldiers around him. "Look at this choreographed nonsense. You think some fancy wrist grab is going to work when someone's really trying to hurt you? When adrenaline is pumping and someone wants to kill you?" Private Johnson shifted uncomfortably next to him. The techniques looked effective to him, and Sergeant Rodriguez clearly knew what she was doing. But challenging Mason's opinion seemed like a dangerous move for a soldier still trying to establish himself in the unit. As the demonstration progressed, Maria moved on to more advanced techniques. She showed how to defend against chokes, how to escape from being pinned on the ground, and how to counter punches and kicks. each technique built on principles she had established earlier, creating a logical progression that the audience could follow and understand. "Remember," she emphasized as she flowed through a series of defensive movements, "these techniques require practice to be effective. Understanding the principle is just the first step. You need to drill these movements until they become automatic responses." Master Sergeant Collins nodded approvingly from the sideline. The demonstration was going exactly as planned, and the audience response was positive. Soldiers were asking good questions, and she could see them mentally practicing the movements as Maria demonstrated each technique. 20 minutes into the demonstration, Collins announced that they would move on to the final section, defending against kicks and more aggressive attacks. This was where Maria's advanced training would really show, and Collins was confident that the audience would be impressed by the sophistication of the techniques they were about to see. Maria took a drink of water and prepared for the most challenging part of the demonstration. The final techniques required precise timing and complete confidence in her abilities. Any hesitation or mistake would be obvious to the trained eyes watching her. But as she prepared to continue, Mason made his move. He stepped forward from the crowd, his large frame imposing as he moved into the demonstration area. The soldiers around him exchanged surprised glances, wondering what he was planning to do. This was not part of the scheduled program. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Mason called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have a question about these techniques you're showing us." Maria looked up, immediately recognizing the challenging tone in his voice. She had dealt with skeptics before, and she understood that how she handled this situation would impact her credibility with the entire audience. "Of course, Staff Sergeant," she replied professionally. "What would you like to know?" Mason walked closer, his boots creating small dust clouds with each heavy step. "I'm wondering how effective these techniques would be against someone who's not cooperating like your training partner here. Someone who's really trying to hurt you and doesn't care about following the rules." The crowd grew quiet, sensing the tension in Mason's voice. Master Sergeant Collins moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. But she wanted to see how Maria would handle the challenge. Dealing with difficult soldiers was part of being an instructor. Maria maintained her composure, recognizing this as a teaching moment rather than a personal attack. "That's an excellent question, Staff Sergeant. These techniques are specifically designed for non-cooperative opponents. The principles work precisely because they don't rely on the attacker's cooperation. Would you like me to demonstrate?" Mason's eyes narrowed. He had expected her to back down or deflect his question. Her willingness to engage directly caught him off guard, but also increased his determination to expose what he saw as the fundamental flaw in this entire demonstration. "Actually," Mason said, stepping even closer, "I think these soldiers deserve to see what happens when someone doesn't play along with your martial arts fantasy. Real combat isn't a tournament with rules and referees." The atmosphere in the training area shifted dramatically. What had been a professional demonstration was rapidly becoming a confrontation. Soldiers in the crowd began to shift nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness an educational exchange or something more serious. Collins stepped forward, her command voice cutting through the tension. "Staff Sergeant Mason, if you have concerns about the training methods, we can discuss them after the demonstration. Right now, we are following a planned curriculum." But Mason was beyond the point of backing down. Months of resentment and frustration had built up to this moment, and he was determined to prove his point regardless of the consequences. "No, Master Sergeant," Mason said, his voice getting louder. "I think we need to address this right now. These soldiers might end up in life or death situations based on what they learn here today. They deserve to see the truth about whether these techniques work against real aggression." Maria realized that this situation was escalating beyond a simple disagreement about training methods. Mason's body language and tone suggested he was looking for a physical confrontation, not a philosophical debate. She had been trained to de-escalate tense situations, but she also recognized when someone was past the point of reasonable discussion. "Staff Sergeant," Maria said calmly, "if you'd like to volunteer as a training partner, I'd be happy to demonstrate these techniques with you. But let's make sure we're doing this safely and professionally." Mason's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Safely? Professionally? Lady, you're teaching people how to fight for their lives, and you're worried about doing it safely? The enemy isn't going to worry about your safety when they're trying to kill you." The crowd was completely silent now, 500 soldiers watching as the tension between these two very different military professionals reached a breaking point. Some soldiers looked uncomfortable, wishing someone would intervene. Others leaned forward, curious to see how this confrontation would resolve. Collins made another attempt to regain control of the situation. "Staff Sergeant Mason, you're out of line. Return to the audience immediately, or I'll have to involve your commanding officer." But Mason was beyond caring about military protocol or the consequences of his actions. In his mind, this was about something much bigger than one training demonstration. This was about standards and reality, and whether the military was going to continue down a path he saw as fundamentally wrong. "You want to see how your techniques work?" Mason said, advancing toward Maria with clear, aggressive intent. "Let me show these soldiers what a real attack looks like." Everything that happened next occurred within the span of a few seconds, but those seconds would be replayed and analyzed countless times in the weeks and months that followed. Mason lunged forward with a powerful kick aimed directly at Maria's midsection. It was not a training attack or a demonstration technique. It was a full-force assault intended to prove his point about the inadequacy of martial arts techniques against real aggression. His leg shot forward with the full power of his 240-pound frame behind it. But Mason had made a critical error in judgment. He assumed that Maria's small size meant she would be too slow or too weak to respond effectively to his attack. He expected to connect with his kick and send her flying backward, proving to everyone watching that technique was no match for raw power and aggression. He was wrong. Maria's response was instantaneous and devastating. Years of training had programmed her muscles to react without conscious thought when faced with an attack. As Mason's leg extended toward her, she stepped slightly to the side, grabbed his ankle with both hands, and used his own momentum against him in a way that he never could have anticipated. The technique she employed was called an ankle pick in wrestling, combined with a sweep that she had learned from her judo training. Instead of trying to stop Mason's powerful kick, she redirected its energy while simultaneously attacking his support leg. The physics were simple but brutal. A man balanced on one leg while kicking with the other is completely vulnerable if that balance is disrupted. Maria pulled Mason's kicking leg upward and forward while sweeping his standing leg backward. Mason, committed to his attack and unprepared for this counter, found himself airborne for a brief moment before crashing to the ground with tremendous force. But the worst was yet to come. As Mason fell, his leg was still trapped in Maria's grip. The angle of his fall and the torque applied to his knee joint created forces that his body was not designed to handle. The sound of his leg breaking was audible to soldiers standing 20 feet away. A sharp crack that cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Mason hit the ground hard, his face twisted in shock and agony. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle below the knee, clearly broken. He tried to speak, but could only produce gasping sounds as his body went into shock from the injury and the sudden reversal of his aggressive assault. The entire incident had lasted less than 5 seconds, from the moment Mason began his attack to the moment he lay broken on the ground. 500 soldiers stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Maria released Mason's leg immediately upon hearing the break, her face showing concern rather than satisfaction. Despite his unprovoked attack, she felt no joy in his injury. Her training had taught her to use only the minimum force necessary to neutralize a threat, but Mason's own aggression had created a situation where serious injury was almost inevitable. "Medic!" Collins shouted, her command voice cutting through the shocked silence. "We need medical assistance here immediately." Several soldiers with medical training rushed forward to assess Mason's condition. Maria stepped back, giving them room to work while mentally reviewing what had just happened. She knew her response had been justified. Mason had attacked her without provocation in front of hundreds of witnesses. But she also understood that breaking another soldier's leg during a training demonstration would have consequences, regardless of the circumstances. As the medics worked to stabilize Mason and prepare him for transport to the base hospital, the crowd of soldiers began to react to what they had witnessed. Some looked shocked, others impressed, and a few appeared disturbed by the sudden violence that had erupted during what was supposed to be an educational demonstration. Mason's friends from his unit pushed forward, some checking on his condition, while others glared at Maria with obvious hostility. They saw their friend and colleague seriously injured, and their first instinct was to blame the person who had hurt him rather than the person who had created the situation through his unprovoked attack. "You broke his leg!" Private Johnson shouted at Maria, his young face flushed with anger and confusion. "He was just trying to prove a point." Maria looked at the young soldier with compassion rather than anger. She understood that he was reacting emotionally to seeing someone he knew get hurt, even if that person had brought the injury on himself through his own poor judgment. "He attacked me without warning," Maria replied quietly. "I defended myself. I'm sorry he was injured, but he created this situation." Collins moved to support Maria while maintaining control of the scene. As the senior instructor, she was responsible for everything that happened during the demonstration, and she knew there would be extensive investigations and reviews of this incident. "That's exactly what happened," Collins announced to the crowd. Staff Sergeant Mason initiated an unprovoked attack during an official training demonstration. Sergeant Rodriguez responded appropriately to defend herself. There will be a full investigation, but the facts are clear to everyone who witnessed this incident. The medics had stabilized Mason enough to transport him to the hospital. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, his eyes met Maria's for a brief moment. Instead of the anger or hatred she expected to see, there was something else. A kind of shocked recognition, as if he was finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. As the ambulance pulled away, carrying Mason to what would be months of surgery and rehabilitation, the crowd of soldiers began to disperse. The planned demonstration was obviously over, but the real lesson had been delivered in a way that none of them would ever forget. Maria stood alone in the center of the training area, still processing what had happened. In a matter of seconds, her life had changed dramatically. She had successfully defended herself against an unprovoked attack, but she had also seriously injured a fellow soldier. The situation was legally and morally clear-cut, but emotionally complex. Master Sergeant Collins approached her with a mixture of support and concern. "Rodriguez, you did everything right. That was a textbook defensive response to an unprovoked assault. But you know there's going to be paperwork, investigations, and probably some difficult conversations ahead." Maria nodded, understanding that this incident would follow her for the rest of her military career. Some people would see her as a hero who stood up to a bully and proved the effectiveness of proper training. Others would see her as the person who broke a fellow soldier's leg during a routine demonstration. As the last of the crowd dispersed and the training area returned to its normal quiet state, Maria reflected on the irony of the situation. Mason had wanted to prove that her techniques wouldn't work against real aggression. Instead, he had demonstrated exactly why those techniques existed and why proper training was so important. The lesson had been delivered, but at a cost that no one had anticipated. Mason would carry the consequences of his poor judgment for the rest of his life, while Maria would carry the weight of having seriously injured another soldier, even in justified self-defense. The morning sun continued to shine down on the now empty training ground, but the atmosphere had changed forever. What had begun as a routine demonstration had become a defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The military hospital buzzed with activity as Derek Mason was wheeled into surgery 3 hours after the incident on the training ground. The break in his right leg was severe, a compound fracture that had damaged not only the bone, but surrounding muscles and tendons as well. The orthopedic surgeon, Major Patricia Williams, examined the X-rays with a grim expression. "This is going to require multiple surgeries," she explained to Mason's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, who had rushed to the hospital upon hearing about the incident. "We're looking at least 6 months of rehabilitation, and there's no guarantee he'll return to full-duty status. The damage is extensive." Meanwhile, across the base, Maria sat in a sterile conference room facing a panel of 3 officers conducting the preliminary investigation. The formal inquiry would take weeks, but military protocol required an immediate assessment of the incident to determine if any disciplinary action was warranted while the investigation proceeded. Colonel Sandra Mitchell, the base's deputy commander, led the questioning. Her 25 years of military experience had taught her to remain objective during emotionally charged situations, but even she was struck by the dramatic nature of what had occurred. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Mitchell began, "walk us through exactly what happened from your perspective. Take your time and be as detailed as possible." Maria recounted the events methodically, from Mason's initial interruption of the demonstration through his unprovoked attack and her defensive response. Her voice remained steady and professional, though she couldn't hide the emotional weight of having seriously injured another soldier. "At what point did you realize Staff Sergeant Mason intended to attack you?" asked Major Robert Chen, the base's legal officer. "When he ignored Master Sergeant Collins's direct order to return to the audience and continued advancing toward me with obvious aggressive intent," Maria replied. "His body language and tone made it clear that he was no longer interested in a professional discussion about training methods." The third officer, Captain Lisa Thompson from the military police, reviewed her notes before asking, "Did you have any previous interactions with Staff Sergeant Mason that might have contributed to his behavior?" "No, ma'am. I had heard about his reputation regarding female soldiers, but we had never spoken directly before today. This appeared to be about his disagreement with the training methods being demonstrated rather than any personal conflict between us." Over the next 2 hours, the panel questioned Maria extensively about her training background, her qualifications to conduct the demonstration, and her response to Mason's attack. They also interviewed Master Sergeant Collins and several soldiers who had witnessed the incident from different angles. The preliminary findings were clear. Mason had initiated an unprovoked assault, Maria had responded with appropriate defensive force, and the injury was an unfortunate but predictable consequence of Mason's own aggressive actions. However, the investigation would continue for several more weeks to ensure all aspects of the incident were thoroughly examined. Word of the incident spread rapidly throughout the base and beyond. In the age of social media and instant communication, news of a female soldier breaking a male colleague's leg during a training demonstration reached military installations worldwide within hours. The story was told and retold, often with details that grew more dramatic with each retelling. Public reaction was sharply divided. Some praised Maria as a symbol of female empowerment and proof that proper training could overcome physical disadvantages. Others criticized her response as excessive and questioned whether someone capable of such violence should be teaching defensive techniques to other soldiers. The divide was particularly evident within the military community itself. Older soldiers, particularly those who shared Mason's traditional views about gender roles in combat, tended to view the incident as evidence that integrating women into combat roles created unnecessary complications and conflicts. Younger soldiers and those with more progressive attitudes saw it as proof that combat effectiveness had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with training, skill, and mental preparation. Many pointed out that Mason's injury was entirely self-inflicted through his decision to attack an instructor during an official demonstration. 3 days after the incident, Maria received an unexpected visitor at her quarters. Sergeant First Class Jennifer Hayes, the female soldier who had sparred with Mason 6 months earlier, knocked on her door with a serious expression. "Can we talk?" Hayes asked. "I think there are some things you should know about Mason's history." Over coffee in Maria's small kitchen, Hayes revealed a pattern of behavior that painted a more complex picture of the man now lying in a hospital bed. Mason's problems with female soldiers went beyond simple disagreement with military policy. They appeared to stem from deep-seated personal issues that had been building for years. "After our sparring match," Hayes explained, "he started making comments about me to other soldiers in his unit. Nothing actionable enough to file a formal complaint, but enough to make my life uncomfortable. He seemed to take it personally that I had beaten him in a fair fight." Hayes went on to describe how Mason had used his rank and influence to make things difficult for several female soldiers in his unit. He would volunteer them for the most unpleasant duties, question their fitness reports, and create an atmosphere where they felt they had to constantly prove themselves worthy of respect. "The thing is," Hayes continued, "I don't think he's fundamentally a bad person. I think he's struggling with changes in the military that challenge everything he was taught about what it means to be a soldier. But that doesn't excuse his behavior, and it definitely doesn't excuse what he did to you." This conversation gave Maria insight into why Mason had been so determined to confront her during the demonstration. It wasn't really about training techniques or military effectiveness. It was about his inability to accept a military culture where his traditional assumptions about gender and combat were no longer valid. Meanwhile, Mason was having his own moment of reckoning in his hospital bed. The pain medication made it difficult to think clearly, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the mental anguish of realizing how badly he had miscalculated the situation. His first visitor was his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who arrived with a grim expression and a folder full of paperwork that would determine Mason's military future. "Derek," Harrison began, using his first name to emphasize the seriousness of their conversation, "I've been your CO for 3 years, and I've seen you excel in many areas. But what happened on that training ground was inexcusable, and there are going to be serious consequences." The charges against Mason were severe: assault on a fellow soldier, disruption of an official training exercise, disobeying a direct order from a superior officer, and conduct unbecoming of a non-commissioned officer. Any one of these charges could end his military career. And together they painted a picture of a soldier who had completely lost his professional discipline. "Sir," Mason said weakly, "I just wanted to prove a point about real combat versus demonstration techniques. I never intended for anyone to get hurt." Harrison's response was sharp, but not without compassion. "Derek, you attacked another soldier without provocation during an official demonstration. What did you think was going to happen?" "Sergeant Rodriguez did exactly what any properly trained soldier should do when faced with an unprovoked assault." As the days passed, Mason had plenty of time to reflect on his actions and their consequences. Fellow soldiers from his unit visited regularly, but their conversations were awkward and strained. Some expressed support for his intentions while criticizing his methods. Others were clearly uncomfortable with what he had done and struggled to reconcile the Mason they knew with the man who had attacked an instructor in front of hundreds of witnesses. The most difficult visitor was his ex-wife, Sarah, who drove 4 hours from their hometown to see him. They had divorced 2 years earlier, largely due to Mason's inability to handle the stress of military life and his increasingly rigid attitudes about traditional gender roles. Sarah had tried to help him work through his issues, but eventually realized that he wasn't willing to change. "Derek," she said as she sat beside his hospital bed, "I'm here because I care about you. But I'm not surprised this happened. You've been angry about women in the military for years. I tried to tell you that your attitude was going to get you in trouble someday." Their conversation lasted 2 hours and covered years of unresolved conflict. Sarah helped Mason understand how his attitudes had contributed to the breakdown of their marriage and his current situation. For the first time, he began to see how his resistance to change had isolated him from the people who cared about him. "I thought I was defending standards," Mason admitted. "I thought I was standing up for what the military should be. But maybe I was just afraid of becoming irrelevant." Meanwhile, the formal investigation into the incident continued. Military investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, reviewed security camera footage from multiple angles, and consulted with experts on military training protocols and use of force guidelines. The findings were unanimous. Maria had acted appropriately and professionally throughout the incident, while Mason had violated multiple military regulations and endangered the safety of everyone present at the demonstration. However, the investigation also revealed systemic issues within Mason's unit regarding attitudes toward female soldiers and adherence to equal opportunity policies. These broader findings led to mandatory training sessions on military professionalism and gender integration for all personnel on the base. The incident had exposed underlying tensions that needed to be addressed before they led to additional problems. 6 weeks after the incident, Maria received notification that all charges against her had been dropped and that she would receive a commendation for her professional handling of a difficult situation. The notification also included an assignment to the Military Training Development Center, where she would help design new training protocols based on lessons learned from recent incidents. The assignment was both an honor and a challenge. It meant her techniques and approach had been validated at the highest levels of military command, but it also meant she would be working under intense scrutiny from people eager to find flaws in her methods. On the same day Maria learned about her new assignment, Mason received his court-martial results. He was found guilty on all charges but received a relatively lenient sentence due to his previous good service record and his cooperation during the investigation. He was demoted 2 ranks, forfeited 6 months' pay, and would be medically discharged from the Army once his rehabilitation was complete. The sentence effectively ended his military career, but allowed him to avoid prison time. Harrison had testified on his behalf, emphasizing Mason's previous exemplary service and arguing that his actions represented an aberration rather than a pattern of criminal behavior. 8 months after the incident, both Maria and Mason had moved on to very different futures. Maria was thriving in her new role, working with military trainers from around the world to develop more effective and inclusive training programs. Her experience had become a case study in military academies, used to teach future officers about the importance of professional conduct and the effectiveness of proper defensive training. Mason had completed his physical rehabilitation and was working as a security consultant for a private company. The job paid well and allowed him to use his military skills in a civilian context. More importantly, he had undergone counseling to address the attitudes and beliefs that had led to his downfall. The counseling had been difficult but illuminating. With the help of a therapist who specialized in military transitions, Mason began to understand how his fear of change and his attachment to traditional military culture had distorted his judgment and led him to make increasingly poor decisions. "I convinced myself that I was defending principles," he told his counselor during one session. "But really, I was just afraid of admitting that my way of thinking might be wrong. I was so invested in being right that I couldn't see how wrong I was becoming." On the first anniversary of the incident, Maria received a letter that surprised her. It was from Mason, written in his own hand on simple stationery. "Sergeant Rodriguez," the letter began, "I owe you an apology that's about a year overdue. What I did to you was inexcusable, and the fact that you were injured could have been much worse. I attacked you because I was afraid of what you represented, a military that was changing in ways I didn't understand and couldn't accept. My injury was entirely my own fault, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for defending yourself. In fact, I've come to understand that your response was exactly what any professional soldier should have done in that situation. I've spent the past year learning about the damage my attitudes caused, not just to you but to other female soldiers who had to deal with my behavior. I'm working to become a better person, but I wanted you to know that what happened that day taught me lessons that probably saved my life and definitely saved my character. I hope your career continues to flourish, and I hope the techniques you teach continue to help soldiers defend themselves and others. You were right about technique overcoming size and strength. I learned that lesson the hard way, but I learned it completely. With respect and apologies, Derek Mason. Maria read the letter twice before deciding how to respond. She appreciated the apology and the evidence that Mason had used his experience as an opportunity for growth rather than an excuse for bitterness. However, she also recognized that some actions have consequences that can't be undone with words alone. She wrote a brief response acknowledging his letter and expressing hope that he would continue working to become the person he wanted to be. She didn't offer forgiveness. That seemed too simple for the complexity of what had happened, but she offered understanding and respect for the effort he was making to change. The incident on the training ground had lasting effects that extended far beyond the two people directly involved. Military training protocols were updated to include more comprehensive guidance on handling disruptions and potential violence during demonstrations. Instructors were given additional training on de-escalation techniques and emergency response procedures. More importantly, the incident sparked broader conversations about gender integration in the military, the importance of professional conduct, and the need to address underlying attitudes that could lead to similar confrontations. These conversations weren't always comfortable, but they were necessary for creating a military culture where all soldiers could serve effectively regardless of their background or physical characteristics. 5 years later, Maria had been promoted to Master Sergeant and was running her own training center. The techniques she taught had been adopted by military units around the world, and her approach to combining physical skill with mental discipline had become a model for modern military training. Mason had married his physical therapist, a woman who helped him understand that true strength came from supporting others rather than dominating them. He never served in the military again, but he found purpose in his civilian career and in his efforts to help other veterans transition to civilian life. The training ground where their confrontation had occurred was renamed in honor of a fallen soldier, but those who had witnessed the incident still remembered it clearly. For some, it remained a cautionary tale about the importance of professional conduct and respect for fellow soldiers. For others, it was proof that proper training and mental preparation could overcome almost any physical disadvantage. Maria never forgot the lesson she had learned that day, not about martial arts or military training, but about the power of remaining true to your principles even when others challenged them aggressively. She had not sought confrontation, but when it came to her, she had responded with skill, professionalism, and restraint. The incident had changed both their lives forever, but in the end, it had also changed the military for the better. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected moments, and sometimes the greatest growth comes from the most difficult challenges. The story that began with anger and ended with understanding became part of military history, studied and discussed by future generations of soldiers who would face their own moments of truth on training grounds around the world.